There is a handout, so please make sure you grab a handout on the way in. We will have it available this evening as well. Okay, we're going to get started. So those of you who don't know me, I'm Jody Monroe, Superintendent. I'd like to welcome everyone for coming out this evening. Hopefully you've had some time to either review some of the board meetings, speak to some of the representatives on the zone's attendance committee, or view some of the information on the website. Tonight we are going to try to kind of do an overview of the process so far, letting everyone know kind of where we are in the process and how we've gotten here. Really the purpose of tonight's meeting is to gather feedback, because all of the information you're hearing, aside from the data collection and some of the pre-work, really we're at a point where we're looking for community input and feedback on some of the initial proposals that will then go back to the committee for review and back to the Board of Education. So I'm going to, just to give you an overview of the evening, I'm going to turn it over to Cadre Technologies, who will give, they are our consultants for this work. They're going to provide a more in-depth review of the process and some of the options that you'll be considering this evening and providing feedback. We go into the breakout rooms. Then we have a short Q&A. Many of you, thank you for submitting questions in advance. And I'm going to try to address some of the more common questions that came in. There were some additional questions that we did not include because they were very specific, and we're just not as far along in the process to be able to address all of those. Then we'll go to breakout rooms, and then we'll reconvene back in the auditorium for a public comment period at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the representatives from Cadre Technology.
Thank you, Jody. Good evening. My name is Ted Dean. I'm with Cadre Technologies, and we're here to provide an update on the work that we have undertaken and some things that we have worked on and share that with you, get your feedback. I'll emphasize what Jody said. We are in the middle of the process. There have been no final decisions made. We're truly here to get your feedback tonight. The agenda, or the project approach that we've been following is laid out here for you. And, the agenda for tonight is we start with a project approach. We'll then talk about the process for defining the neighborhood boundaries. Then we ask Tim Ammon to come up and talk about the demographic projections. We'll then review and walk through the process of how we have come up with the initial scenarios for the proposed zone adjustment changes. And then we'll look at the breakout sessions. And we're going to do the Q&A, and then we'll go into the breakout sessions. So this is the project timeline that we've been following. So across the top, you can see the various phases, and then you can see the tasks that we've been working on. And I highlighted November in red to show you that we are in the middle of the process. Jody said we've been doing a lot of data gathering, a lot of planning work to build a foundation upon which we can develop and evaluate the various proposed options here. We have incorporated some of the initial feedback from the Zone Attendance Committee. So that is a committee that the district formed to work with us. That committee has representatives from district administration. It has representatives from every elementary school and the high school. And it has parent representatives from every elementary school. And so that group has worked on gathering some data, helping us to define the neighborhoods, providing some initial feedback on where the various zoning changes or planning units can be changed. Some other things that we still have to work on is the model of transportation impact. If we start talking about students who are going to attend different elementary schools, we have to get them there somehow. They can't walk. And so there's a project underway to understand what those transportation impacts would be, and that is something we're working on as well. And then we're here for the community feedback session. We'll take that information and incorporate it, and then we would hope to be back to the board in December with another round of recommendations, another set of options to consider based on the feedback that we gained at that point. So again, nothing here is final. We're coming to you midway to solicit your feedback. A big part of what the committee has worked on so far is to define what we're calling neighborhood boundary definitions. So what does that mean? What is a neighborhood boundary? Before you go to the next slide. So they're the planning units upon which we will make the decisions about who would potentially go to a different elementary school. We have to look at a map and make some decisions about what constitutes one of these planning units. And so you look at things like a neighborhood. So for example, a subdivision that may be constructed all at the same time. You look at physical features like highways or busy roads. So think about Delaware Avenue and the bypass. There could be water features that are also natural breaks in the neighborhood. You also consider land use changes. You go from a residential to a commercial and back to a residential, and sometimes a logical divide in a neighborhood. And then sometimes you would look at changes in housing type. If you're going from a single-family area to a multi-family area, those sometimes create logical definitions, or logical breaks in the boundary. So this is what the result of that process looks like and where we currently are. And we've done a lot of work on these boundaries. One of the things we're going to ask for your feedback on tonight is the definition of these boundaries. Do they make sense? Are they a logical unit? You probably have some opinions about where these boundaries should be drawn. We want you to provide that feedback, and we'll take a look at it and consider it for incorporation into the next revision of that. What you're going to see here when we go into the little more detailed description of the various scenarios are these units moving along. You can go back to the slide. Moving from zone to zone. They're color-coded by their current enrollment zone, and then we will show a different shading when it's moving to a different zone. Some of the things we talked about during the process for creating these neighborhood planning units also included the idea that more units are better. There's an inclination to want to make some bigger areas, and the challenge with that is then you have to make big changes. And one of the tenets of our project here is going to try to minimize the impact. And so if we have planning units that have 60, 70, 80 students in them, that doesn't allow us to make small changes. We're required to make big changes at that point. So we encouraged the committee, and then we took their feedback and created some smaller units that would allow us to make smaller changes. There were multiple groups who provided a lot of input on this, so even though we broke that into the various elementary school groups, the groups had comments about other areas of town, other areas of the school district, and we looked at those, and sometimes they were conflicting, and we had to make some decisions around what that boundary would be. And we're looking for your feedback tonight on those boundaries when we go into the breakout rooms. With that, I'm going to ask Tim Ham to come up, and he's going to walk through the development of the enrollment projection.
Good evening. Thank you, Roz. I mentioned my name is Tim Ham. When we think about enrollment projections, I think one of the things is that many of you might be familiar with is that the district is regularly evaluating not only the number of students who are in the schools now, but also the projected number of students who will be coming in at any given time. And from a methodology perspective, one of the ways that this is done, and is the way that it's done most commonly across the state, is to think about what is referred to as a cohort survival, right, which is the number of students that advance from grade to grade. So if we think about from a cohort standpoint, if we had 100 students in a kindergarten, in the following year, there are 105 students in the first grade. What we end up with is a 1.05 cohort survival. Right? We've got a little bit of growth. So if we think about cohorts, the important thing to recognize when we start to think about what these rates mean is anything above 1 represents growth. Anything below 1 represents a decline, and anything at 1 is stable. And so we are looking for across not only all of the grades, but also all of the schools at what these rates look like. And the combination of the cohort rate plus looking at births within the community is one of the things that we think about, right, is students born 5 years ago represent this year's kindergarten class, right? So we think about births, we think about cohort survival, and then the third piece that we think about is the housing component. What does development have the potential to do to the total counts in schools? And so as we go through talking about the enrollment projections, just understand that all of those things become a factor in thinking about what the numbers are that we eventually end up deriving. And so when we look at the projections, well, one of the things that we see, ultimately I think, and many of you may have heard of this before, right, this represents 5 years of projections, it represents 5 years by grade for projections as well. And I think some of you have heard previously that the district's projections from the Capital Region Planning Commission are in. They show slight growth overall, but one of the things that they also show is a slight decline at the elementary school level. So when we are working at the projections, one of the things that we're thinking about is looking at the differences between outgoing 5th grade and incoming kindergarten. Right? Because if we have a larger 5th grade going out than a kindergarten coming in that building or in that grade, in that grade being the year, the number of students is obviously going to decline. Right? So we're paying attention to those numbers in particular when we are looking at what might happen overall. So there's a couple of things that we would want to point out. I think one of the first things that we want to point out is just looking at kindergarten registration. One of the things that we see from the 2025 year is, again, if you think about kindergartners in 2025 being 2020 births, 1920, that period of time, the live births at that point were actually about 7% lower than they historically have been on average. But then when we look at what we refer to as the COVID bubble, right? Those births were actually, the 2025 numbers were about 12% lower than that, right? So what we see is we end up with essentially this progression from a projected kindergarten enrollment perspective that identifies not only that we've got a bubble of kindergarten students as a consequence of COVID, but we also have sort of a return in the out years to a more normal and expected distribution of kindergarten enrollment. Okay? So again, this is why the 3 factors, including the live birth piece, obviously becomes important, because what happens when we look at this is kindergartners become first graders become second graders become third graders. So when we look at an enrollment chart from year to year, one of the things that you have to remember is you really have to look diagonally, which we will talk about here in a moment, and not horizontally. Okay? So as we're going forward, we'll talk more about that. And we do see, again, if you look at overall, we do see this slight decline, but a decline in terms of total students. When we think about it over the population of not only all the schools, but all the sections, right, is a relative bit of stability around enrollment. Thank you. So we mentioned as well that in addition to looking at historical practices plus live births, we're also trying to think about what the impact of development may be and housing. And for purposes of what we have been doing so far, the development that we've been incorporating into the projections are places where the development has actually been formally approved or is under construction. And what happens is there are a set of factors that have been developed through things like the American Community Survey, a record study, a study out of Massachusetts from an organization called Consult, that looks at the yield, meaning the number of students that comes out of individual housing types when there's development. And that yield gets applied to the number of different types of units that are in that development to try to determine how many school-age children may come out. And so if we have, for example, which we have here in some instances, in the Kill Manor development, we have 34 houses that have been approved, 36 houses that have been approved as single-family attached houses and 14 that are single-family detached. When we apply the formula to that, what we end up with is 15 students total. Now, one of the things that we have to recognize is not all of those 15 students are going to be elementary school students. They're going to spread in some way across all of the grades. So, in addition to applying the housing factor, we also apply a factor that recognizes that there are different tranches of students. And as a result, one of the things that we look at from that development specifically, for example, is that we have a yield of 8 students coming out of there. And now those students get added into the mix in some way. And one of the things that we have to determine is when. When do they get into the mix? For purposes of the analysis that we're doing now, we've incorporated all of those students into 2026. You might say, why would we do that? Firstly, it's the most conservative assumption that we can make. Right? Ultimately, we are pulling the impact as far forward as we possibly can in order to try to determine what the impact on the classroom requirements might be. Secondly, one of the things that we know is that there is a shortage of housing here. So it's very likely that as a developer, I'm going to be diligent in my development in order to be able to try to get homes. So again, the idea of thinking that we should pull things as far forward as we can to try to have the impact be as early in the projections and to carry through the projections for as long as possible gives us a set of the most conservative assumptions that we can, which we think is a responsible way to go about doing this. What's important to recognize as well is similar to what we were just talking about in the way the kids progress through grades from a normal set of enrollment projections, students that we're adding into the mix from a housing perspective also progress through those grades. So what you see is you see the ladder. For example, the 5 kindergarten students in 2026-27 become 5 first graders in 2027-28, and so on and so on and so on. Right? So what we end up being able to do at that point is to be able to combine, and we can go to the next slide, is we will combine the organic projections, right, which is the students moving through the schools, plus the housing to have an understanding of what the total impact is. So those two factors together get incorporated and represented in this chart here, which again is the K5 with the inclusion of organic projections plus housing. What you see highlighted is a recognition that occasionally, and this happens more than I think people recognize, but we end up with a bubble, right? So we see the COVID bubble right here. And again, we mentioned that you have to look diagonally here to see how it affects schools on a go-forward basis. But we see the large number of kindergarten students, we see an increasing number of those students in first grade. Why is that? Because historically what the district has experienced is some growth between kindergarten and first grade, right? We mentioned this cohort survival value. That value is greater than 1. And so we see an increasing number of kindergartners moving to first graders moving to second grade. And that carries all the way through. We do that for the full 5 years of the projection for all of the grades. This then gets disaggregated, which we'll talk about here in a minute, at all of the schools, so that we can look at a 5-year projection not only at the district level, but then also be able to bring that down into the school level. And I think what's important to recognize is 2 things from a population perspective here. What we're talking about is general ed students and integrated classroom students only. Right? This does not include the special needs population. There are some comments around special needs that we'll hear not only in the Q&A, but are also included in the frequently asked questions sheet. So if you don't have one of those, I would suggest you get one of them to see some of those commentary. And then in addition, what we also have is an effort to try to manage this bubble as we go forward. Right? Recognizing that this is not a permanent problem, but it is a problem that will be transient through the school as those students progress from grade K through 5. Okay. And so when we get to here, this is the district-wide projection. Then, if we take that projection apart, and we have those students allocated to their individual schools. And so we have a 5-year projection for individual schools that is composed of that composes the total that we were showing earlier. A couple of things to recognize about this chart. Areas where you see in red are schools that, based on their projection, are greater than the target enrollment, meaning we have more kids than we can fit in the building. So we have to think about how to manage that. In addition, what we have to think about is, in order to determine that, one of the ways that we have gone through this, and for folks who have participated in the process or seen any of the materials, one of the efforts that we have to go through is to look at all the classrooms that are available in an individual building, understand how many students we might fit in that class at any given class at any given grade level, right? So we have a class size value and a number of classes, and that gives us an available capacity. One of the things that we've done from a process perspective here is to maintain one of the classrooms for purposes of flexibility. So for example, if we have a school with 13 rooms in it, we're actually only using 12 right now for purposes of managing the capacity rates that we're using at the schools. Okay? So this is an effort where what we are trying to do is to ensure that we are filling the schools appropriately, but maintaining enough flexibility to account for some continuing growth, and also maintaining enough flexibility to ensure that we can continue to provide the academic programs that we are providing throughout the district. Right? So what we see when we look at, again, the core aspects of this is we know we've got 2 schools we've got to work on right away. We also know that when we're looking at target enrollments and we're looking at how to manage some of these neighborhood planning units that Ted was mentioning earlier, right? Those movements are designed to try to mitigate any effort to be above those target numbers. Will it be perfect? It's never perfect. And the reason it's never perfect is because A, we can't tell everybody where to live, B, we can't tell them how old they should be, right? So a perfect grade breakage where we've got, exactly, 20 first graders in every school, in every section, it's not a thing we can manage. Right? We know that because we see the bubble coming through. So it's important, I think, as we start to look at how do we manage this, that we are managing the reality of a bunch of different uncontrolled variables that we're trying to fit into this available capacity that is created in any of the given schools. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Ted to talk a little bit about the options and the zones of attendance and some of that movement that we've been talking about so far.
Thanks, Tim. So with that, I want to walk through the process that we followed to build on those demographic projections and how we came up with some of the. So one of the things that we haven't talked about, what is actually happening right now, is that the students who moved into the district over the summer had to go to a different elementary school because there wasn't capacity in their home school. And so we have, for example, 11 or 12 kindergarten students who are currently going to Ellesmere but don't live in the current Ellesmere enrollment zone. So when we start this analysis, we want those students to end up in their home school, if you will. So we move them back. So we take the students, we had to identify, there's 39 specific students who are currently attending a school out of zone, and we move them back to their home zone. So as we begin the process, we can understand the impact of having all those students in their correct zone. As Tim mentioned, then we've adjusted the enrollment projections based on the counts and the construction projects and subdivisions that are underway. We also went through and we took the student file from the school district and we geocoded every student. What does that mean? We put them on the map, and we put a pin on the map. We're all familiar with that from Google. And we looked at that data to make sure that we knew those students were in the right place on the map. So that, as again, we're looking at how they would move when we're moving, say, zone 17 from one area to another. We know exactly what students were moving, what the impact at the grade level and the exact student level would be. Also recognizing that the students that we put back into their home zone are moving correctly. Once we have all that foundation laid, we went back to the district to really verify the room counts that are in each building, because that's an important part of the process. And so we had done an initial survey in the summer. Things changed, the school opens, and we re-verified that we had the exact rooms available for instruction, for general instruction. We then talked about the target class sizes. What is, from the district's perspective, the ideal number of students in kindergarten, first grade, second grade? Tim said everything was perfect. What would perfect look like, or ideal? And the district worked through that, and then that was actually presented at the November 5th board meeting, what those targets were. So we took those targets and put those into the model. Now, with all of that as a baseline, we can start to look at the impact of moving one zone from one enrollment area to another. Some other criteria that was discussed with the zone of attendance committee and is brought into the process was maintaining contiguous zone attendance boundaries. So what does that mean? In a perfect world, or in a lot of situations, we wouldn't have students from school A being transported through enrollment zones for schools B and C to attend school D. Right? That's not ideal. It creates longer bus ride times, it creates a transportation impact. We're losing some of that sense of community if we do that. We're also, as we talked about before, only considering moving whole neighborhood units. That's why the definition of those planning units becomes so important, because we're going to move that whole unit to try to maintain some continuity, understanding that if we move a group of students, we would want them to have their friends from their neighborhood moving with them. We also are looking at the transportation impacts. When we start moving students from enrollment zones, we have to get them to school if they can't walk. And so we will look at the actual ride times, and we'll talk about that in a second, and try to maintain consistent ride times for all students. Now we know that folks who live out 443 and that part of the school district are going to have longer ride times. It's just one of those facts that we can't do much about. But everything else being equal, we would like to try to keep the average ride times the same. And then, as Tim mentioned, and it was part of the direction from the district, is we want to look at ways to try to maintain some capacity for future growth. And this is an imperfect science. We're trying to be very, very precise in an area that is, by definition, imprecise, for what Tim just mentioned, all these things that we can't control. So we need to create some slack in the system and in the models, and understand that if we get a lot of late registrations, like happened at the beginning of this school year, the district has the capacity to try and integrate as many of those registrations into their own schools as possible. There's also been a lot of discussion about this concept or this term of school equity. I'm sure when you hear that term, you have certain things that come to mind. And what we thought was important to share here tonight was what was the definition of school equity that was used in this project. So these are the things that we considered and talked about as trying to maintain school equity. The first thing was the goal to maintain a minimum of 2 sections per classroom of physical instructional spaces for each grade. And I think, I'm not an educator, but I'm told that there's benefits to having 2 kindergarten classes for grade. That way the students aren't going through their K-5 experience with just one set of kids. They get a chance to meet and interact with other students. We're also, one of the goals that the district had was to try to minimize the impact of overcrowding. When you have classrooms that are empty, literally empty in one building, and you have classrooms that are bursting at the seams in the other building, that's not school equity. You have crowded hallways, crowded cafeterias, and so that changes the student's experience in the building. So if we can balance the enrollment more appropriate to the size and the target capacity that we showed earlier. That's going to create a more equitable experience. There was also a desire to have the opportunity to have equal programs in the school. And then lastly, we wanted to have the opportunity to try to manage the ride times. What you can see here on the slide are the current average AM ride times for general transportation, and then special needs transportation, and then the same thing in the afternoon. Now, there are school bus rides that are longer, we know that, right? There's school bus rides that are shorter, but these are the average ride times as we look at the entire K to 5 transportation program. So one of the goals will be to try to maintain average ride times in these ranges. This has been on an eye chart, but what we're going to go through next is to walk you through the process of how do we determine what happens when we move the neighborhood from one area to another. So I'm going to start with the number at the top left. It says 38. You can't read that back. I'm right there with you. I can't read it either sometimes. That's our current 2025 enrollment for that grade in that building. As I mentioned before, I'm going to move one cell to the right there. We had to take the out-of-zone students and put them back in their home school. So in some cases, the number to the right, which in this case is 27, it's going to go up if I'm putting students back to their home school. In the case of the Ellesmere example here, it goes down because we moved 11 or 12 students out of that school. We then do that grade advance process that Tim showed, moving the students diagonally along the chart, right? So we're going to take our kindergartners and we're going to make them first graders, and that number of 27 that we see there is not going to go to stay at 27 for the reasons Tim talked about, right? We have a slightly, historically, first graders are grades are a little bit higher than kindergarten, so 27 in this case becomes 30, and we do that all the way down for all the grades. And so that shows, as we start the process for 2026 with no changes, Ellesmere would have a target enrollment of 218 students. Then we would look at what areas we would move from another enrollment zone into Ellesmere. And in this case, we're proposing to move 22 students. So 218 becomes 240. And then comes a little bit of art and a little bit of science. We have to make some determinations using our target class sizes about how many physical instructional spaces do we need to educate those 240 students. So there's a little bit of science to say, hey, we can take our target class size, divide it into our enrollment for that grade, and come up with a number. And since we try to balance things out, there's a little bit of art there. So if you had 40 kindergarten students and you had a target kindergarten class of 18, would we have 3 sections? Maybe the class is kind of small, so we probably have 2 sections of 20. So we have to make those decisions about how we would physically or actually create those classes within that building. And so that's the last number on the right. That's the likely number of sections that we would have. And so if we total up all the sections to meet the new demand, without considering what we would probably do, we'd have 15, which is 2 over what our capacity currently is, so that doesn't work. But in reality, we would probably do that in 13 physical classrooms, and that would leave 0. So really no flex space that we're looking at. So those are the things, this is how we get to and do the analysis on the impact of all of the moves. One back. So before we get into the walking through each of the options, I want to remind everybody, these are additional proposals, and we're looking for your feedback on them tonight. We developed 3 overall proposals, and the first proposal, A, at the district's direction, has 3 options that we were asked to look at. Each one of these proposals has pros and cons. They're kind of looking at the enrollment, the ability to have capacity to create additional flexibility, transportation, all of those things come into play. And there is no perfect solution, as Tim said, right? This is an imperfect science, we're looking for a perfect solution, and there is not one. So there are going to be trade-offs that we're going to have to look at. looking for your input on that. The district will ultimately have to decide. All right, let's look at what I'm going to do next. Hang on a second. What I'm going to do next is walk you through all of the options. And my intent here is to explain what is moving, right? So I'm going to try to do my best to explain neighborhoods that are moving, describe the neighborhoods as we go through that so you can understand what each one of these changes involves. So, and then we'll talk about the number of students that are impacted with each change. That will be the last part of my presentation. So then we're going to go out to, we're going to do the Q&A, and then we'll go out to the breakout. All right, let's look at the first option, option A1. So in option A1, and all of the A options have a few moves that are the same. So the moves that are all the same start with areas 53 and 54, which a lot of us would know as the Long Meadow Drive area. And those would move, those students would move to Claremont. The next area would be area 51, which is known as the Westchester Woods neighborhood, and that would move to Hanover. The next part, again, these are all part of option A, all of the three areas in option A. 57, 58, 89, and 90. So those are the houses between the bypass and Purebush that are along Murray and the side streets that dump into, coming off of Murray. Those would move to Slingers. And then the last part of the base part of option A would be areas 14 and 15, which is the area that the houses inside roads off the Bender and the bypass down to the power companies. And those would move to Hanover. All right, so let's talk about where things get a little different here. I'm going to ask Laura to kind of flip back and forth between this slide and the next slide so you can kind of see. So you go to option A2 and the back. So you can see it's just that cell, the blue cell in the top right of the change. So option A1 has what we're calling area 33. That's the area on Ellesmere and Bender, on Kenwood down to Pine. That would move into Ellesmere. So that's option A1. Option A2, so all those same base options, but this time instead of area 33, we looked at area 79 and 34. And those are the houses and side roads fronting on Adams, Kenwood, and then Adams again down to Ellesmere, and then Ellesmere down to George. So those would move. All of these options, the changes, all have the same relative number of students. And then option 3 of A would be moving area 88, which is the houses fronting on Bender from Hampshire down to the bypass. And those would move into Timber. Into Ellesmere. Go to the next slide. So this is a summary of those moves. So you can see the table on the left. There's 132 students that would be part of all of the A options. And then you can see the impact of 3 variations on option A. We're in that range of about 148 to 154 students. Let's move on to option B. Well, option B, we start out by leaving areas 53 and 54, so the Long Meadow neighborhood in Claremont. Areas 51, 57, 58, 89, and 90 would still move to Hanover. But now, because we didn't take students out of Glenmont would still be in an overcrowded situation, we have to find another set of students to move out, and that would be, in this scenario, area 62, which is known as the Enclave, and that would move into Glenmont. And then we need to find a way to get some students out of Glenmont. So now it would be areas 14, 15, and 16, which is the total of area acres would move from Glenmont to Hanover, and 88 would move from Hanover to Ellesmere. So this scenario, the next slide, has more impact. A total of 185 students that would move if, under this scenario. And then the last option that we've looked at this point is option C. So in areas 51, 57, 58, 89, and 90 are the same as the previous options. We would be back to putting areas 53 and 54 in the Slingerlands. And now we look at area 88, area 8, which is the houses and side roads on the west side of Whipple, from Pure down to Somerset. They would move from Glenmont to Hanover. Okay, all of these proposed moves have the goal of trying to take students out of Eagle and Glenmont and put them in schools that have additional capacity. And that option impacts 120 days. You want me to introduce the breakout sections, or you want to do the Q&A? Okay, great.
Okay, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to go through some of the frequent questions. I'm going to try to go through these relatively quickly because these will be available for everyone. But I want to highlight some of the major, I guess, recurring questions that we've received that might help better understand the process and answer some questions that you may have tonight. So you go ahead. So the agenda I already went through. We're going to, after this, break out into the breakout sessions. And we're going to just start with the Q&A. So the first one, why is there a sudden need to make changes to enrollment zones? So I wouldn't say it's sudden. This has been something we talked about as we've done our budget and enrollment projections for the last couple of years. But currently, 3 of our 5 elementary schools are experiencing serious challenges. As you saw in the presentation, Glenmont is over capacity, Glenmont and Eagle are at capacity. Ellesmere did not have enough students this year for 2 sections of kindergarten, which is why, as Ted mentioned, we moved several students into kindergarten at Ellesmere in order for them to have 2 sections. So this is something that we need to examine and look at not only what we can do for next year to balance out our facilities, but also for the future. In previous presentations, it was noticed that modest increases were inspected in grades K-5. Has that changed? So as mentioned, we do use the Capital District Region Planning Commission. We have for probably over a decade at this point. The projections have been very reliable, many years down to literally 1 student. So these are the most recent projections being used by Tyler, and we are looking at this out through 2029-30. It is important to note that K-5 enrollment in 25-26 did grow, and as Ted said, we did have substantial increases over the summer, which is a bit unusual from what we've had in the past. But the enrollment is still projected to grow at both Glenmont and at Eagle. We keep hearing about low enrollment in Ellesmere. Why is having these 2 sections so important? And we reference this somewhat. Balancing students' needs academically, socially, programmatically, allowing students to have the support and providing students with more classmates to interact with. This was a lengthy conversation among the committee that a minimum of 2 sections also supports teacher collaboration, materials, and creates more stability, not only within the grade, but within their elementary experience. Grandfathering, this has been brought up when is there opportunities for grandfathering? Grandfathering basically provision for all students, meaning all the current K-5 students, would not allow us to address the current imbalance. We have discussed this in the committee. The need is immediate, so looking at what could we consider, and this was brought up at the Board of Education meeting, as we move forward with what the potential shifts could be, we will consider a model for grandfathering that will be presented, and the board would consider it. I would say that that is one area that there is significant transportation impact if you're looking at grandfathering students. Is the goal keeping siblings together? Yes, that's absolutely the goal. Could you explain why schools that are not at capacity may still have students reassigned? And I think that when you looked at the maps, we talked about continuous enrollment boundaries. We've been working on this, and obviously the goal of the committee, we did identify maintaining smaller class sizes as a priority for students district-wide. The committee also prioritized continuous boundaries for school attendance zones for those neighborhood opportunities. So keeping those things together, movement may be required for students in any of our attendance zones to balance out and meet those needs. Will there be a plan to support students who are rezoned? Absolutely. We've already had discussions about this. What hasn't been said tonight, and I think is important, is that the district has rezoned or redistricted students multiple times over the year. The most recent being when, well, the larger redistricting was when Eagle opened, and then shortly thereafter when Clarksville closed. Prior to that, in fact, Tyler Technologies has done many of the redistricting that are pretty much done every 10 to 15 years. So it's not uncommon for districts to have to reevaluate their attendance zones and redistrict and rezone based on changing demographics across the district. Will redistricting take into account keeping new students within their home attendance zones? So one of the goals of examining the zones is to reduce the need for administrative placement, and that's what we're seeing more of as students come in. If they are coming in to the schools that have high numbers of students, we're not able to place them there, and they end up in schools outside of their attendance zone. So this practice has increased in the last few years, creating some imbalances. Out-of-zone placements are only used when necessary, and every effort is made to accommodate them in their full schools, but when you reach a certain capacity, we do need to consider that and have been considering that as an option. Are the plans recognizing the large Clinton Farm development in Kenwood? I think this was already addressed, the housing developments that are being considered in the projections. We did get from the town, and those are currently the ones that have been approved or are under construction. It seems like it would be more cost-effective and less disruptive to add to crowded buildings, add on to crowded buildings. I think it's very evident that we have space across the district. It does not make sense when we have adequate space. Adding on to buildings is extremely costly. To do that, there are currently 15 K-5 classrooms that are not being used for general instruction. That doesn't mean they're not being used for other things. In addition, there are no enrollment projections that we've seen that show the type of growth that would support adding additional classrooms on. Have flex zones been considered? Where families moving into a particular area would be assigned to a school based on capacity. We have looked into flex zones and have had discussions with other districts who do have this as an option. Flex zones would not serve the immediate needs of the district. Flex zones are often used in areas where you see potentially a surge in housing development, which we're not expecting to see. Our needs are now, and housing development is not expected to have a significant impact on our enrollment over the next 5 years. Will any increases in school census lead to capital improvements at those facilities? Again, this is something that as we're looking at our enrollment, as we're doing our building condition surveys and potential future bond project, we always look at this in regards to our space and what our needs are. Have you considered the impact of parents' dissatisfaction with the rezoning effort on the December 2nd capital project vote? Yes, we consider that. That's why we have the question here. There are plenty of ways for people to register on their dissatisfaction. We understand this is an emotional issue for many. However, we are proposing $60 million in building improvements that are planned. It would mean delays in critical infrastructure and safety updates at all schools, and so in increases in emergency repairs, and most certainly a second referendum would be needed with increased costs and resources. How are related services rooms such as OT, PT, and speech being factored into building level classroom counts? In buildings with available rooms, related services are using some of the spaces. However, as you saw, we have buildings who do not have those spaces available, and they are limited as to what they can use, which is one of the reasons we want to have some flexibility with the spaces that we do have, and we don't want every building to be at maximum capacity. So the goal of using our space more efficiently would allow all of our buildings to have more flexibility in space for these related services. How will rezoning benefit special education students, particularly in relation to class sizes, services, and proximity to specialized programs? Rezoning that provides for more equitable distribution of all our students will actually benefit all of our students in regards to programs and services that can be offered in all of our buildings. And what considerations are being made for reducing additional movement for special education students, particularly those in closed classrooms? So in our current models and in the numbers you saw tonight, any students who are placed in the school for a special education program are accounted for in the current school they're in program. They are not included in the numbers to return to their home schools for 2026-7 or future projections. The enrollment changes at the elementary schools will impact enrollment in after-school programs, and how will programs like Schools Out be notified. We do have regular communication with Schools Out. Once a plan has been finalized, obviously we will work with Schools Out for them in regards to before and after-school programs that will be offered in any other programs to ensure they're fully engaged and prepared for changes. And have you considered an option of just centralizing kindergarten in one building? We did actually do this for many years. All of our kindergartners were in Slingerlands. For those of you who maybe don't remember, it shows me how old I am. But the district was located in Slingerlands. When we returned, we actually made kindergarten full day. Kindergarten returned to all of their home schools when it was determined that that was best for students and for families to keep K-5 in the same buildings. Have you considered putting UPK classrooms in the under-enrolled buildings? We actually have discussed this. It has come up in the committee meeting. However, placing all UPK students in an under-enrolled school would also then require them to move again for kindergarten. Additionally, UPK programs operate on different schedules, have different requirements than K-5 programs. So at this time, the district's determined that balancing K-5 enrollment provides a more effective solution, both programmatically and instructionally. Follow? Okay. All right, so those are the many of the same questions that I thought it was important to share those out. So what we're going to do now is we're going to the breakout sessions. So a couple pieces of information before you leave. When you go outside in the hall, you're going to go left, and there are breakout sessions, and there are signs to show you where each group is located. It is designated by school. One of the pieces of information we really do hope that we get from you is feedback. The purpose of tonight is for you to look at the options, to look at what's recommended, and also for you to share other thoughts and ideas that you may have. There are kiosks in each of the rooms for you to actually enter information, but we are reconvening here afterward so it's almost 7:30 now, so we might wait until 8 or 8:15. We'll see how the rooms are going, reconvene here, and you can share comments or suggestions you may have with us here as well. So there's a couple different options to provide feedback. So this is the way I want to thank everyone for coming out. We'll reconvene relatively around 8 or 8:15.